In the last video, you learned how to display both string and visual component data in a data group container using the default item renderers. While these classes are very useful for simple displays, they do not allow you the full range of expressiveness that you might want to employ for your application. In this video, you will learn the basic building blocks for creating your own custom item renderers. You will first build an item render inline and then as a separate class file. When you create a custom item renderer, you have full control over the display of the data. You can use any components and containers you need to in order to manipulate the visual display. You can create a custom item renderer in two ways. This first code sample shows the item renderer property nested within the data group container. The second code example shows the item renderer property referencing an external class file. In this video, you will learn how to implement a custom item renderer in both ways. This is the data for my sample application that I will use in my data group container's item renderer. In the last video, I used string and bitmap image tags for the data. In this video, I have consolidated the data into generic object instances with name-value pairs. You will often see this done to ensure that related data is handled as a unit. Below the layout property in the data group container, I'm adding an item renderer set. Within this code, I'm creating an instance of a component using the component class. This instance cannot be empty, and it is defining a new scope for the content it contains. Lastly, I will create an actual item renderer instance using the item renderer class. Take care to note that the outer item renderer is named with a lowercase I, which denotes that it is a property of the data group container. The inner item renderer block is an instance of the item renderer class, which is why it begins with an uppercase I. The item renderer instance can contain many tags, including these listed here. You will learn more about states in a later video of this day. For now, just know that states define different visual aspects of your renderer. For instance, in a data group container item, you might have a normal state that users see by default, and then a hovered state that users see when they mouse over the item. To create states, simply create a states property block in your item renderer tag block and create one state instance for each state. You must always define at least the normal state. Back in Flash Builder, I'm creating a states property inside of the item renderer instance. I'm creating one state named normal. This code shows a button instance inside of the item renderer instance. You can implement single components like this. If you want to use multiple components in your renderer, you must place them inside a container. Remember that the component tag block represents a new scope. That means that everything inside of it is blind to the content outside of it. To access data within the item renderer, you must do so through a property named data. In this code, you can see that a label control inside of the item renderer would reference the last name and first name values from the data provider object by referencing the data object. I want to display the employee's image below his or her name, so I'm adding a vgroup container below the states block to lay out this display. I'm creating a label control that binds the text property to the data.firstName value, and then a literal space, and then the data.lastName value. The bitmap image control source property will be bound to the data object's image file value, which references the images stored in the images directory of the project. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that each employee is displayed with the image below the name. Notice the default hover state. Remember that each employee's display represents one rendered iteration over the items in the data provider dataset. I want to create a visual distinction between each item by applying a gray background and border, so I'm changing the vGroup container into a border container instance. I still want the content to be laid out vertically, so I'm adding a layout property with a vertical layout instance. I'm also going to horizontally align the content to the center and vertically align it to the middle. To add the border around each item, I'm adding a border weight property set to a value of 2 pixels and a background color set to a value of CCCCCC, which is gray. I'm also adding the height and width properties set to values of 100%. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that each item in the data group container is rendered visually distinct from the others. You can imagine that writing complex item renderer displays inline to the data group container may get unwieldy. Therefore, you can also create the ItemRenderer display in a separate class file and then simply reference it from the ItemRenderer property. The class file will extend the ItemRenderer class, and all the other rules you just learned about creating item renderers do apply. By convention for this training series, I'm storing my component files in a components directory. In the Package Explorer, I am right-clicking on the source folder for this project and selecting New Item Renderer. In the New Item Renderer dialog box, I'm typing Components for the package and Employee Item Renderer for the name. I'm clicking Finish. In the new Employee Item Renderer MXML file that opened in the editor view, I'm deleting the generated label control and then returning to the main application file. Within the data group container instance, remember that the component tag block creates a new component scope and is essentially like creating a new component class file. The item renderer tag block is the actual instance of the renderer and is represented by the fact that we are extending this class in the new class file. I'm cutting all the code inside the item renderer block and then returning to the new class file and pasting it. I'm saving the file to maintain my changes and then returning to the main application file. I'm deleting the nested item renderer property from the data group container and replacing it with an inline item renderer property. For the value, I'm pointing to the components.employee item renderer class file. Remember that the class file is in the components directory. When I save the file and run the application, I see that I have an error. When I look at my code, I see that I have misspelled components, which I'm fixing, and saving the file again. When I run the file, you can see that the display is exactly the same. The only difference is structural. I have separated the item renderer code from the main application code for easier maintainability. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Displaying Dynamic Data in a Custom Item Renderer.